Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Global Connections Television is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution such as a university or a high school that has an intra-campus television hookup, please go to our website. You can download those programs free of charge because Global Connections Television is provided as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're going to be taking a look at a very interesting program, the Grawemeyer Program at the University of Louisville, and also talk about some of the topics and how they tie into an overall theme of chaos in the world. And we're seeing a lot of chaos, be it in Syria, the Korean Peninsula, in Iran, and many other places of the world, and how some of the scholars and some of the winners of the Grawemeyer Award have had some illuminating topics and books written about these topics, and we're going to be focusing on them very shortly. My guest today is Dr. Charles Ziegler. Dr. Charles Ziegler is a professor and distinguished university scholar at the University of Louisville. Dr. Ziegler is the director of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. He's also the executive director of the Louisville Committee on Foreign Relations. Dr. Charles Ziegler, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Oh, thanks. Great to be with you.
I appreciate you being back. We did this about 4 years ago. There's so much chaos in the world and so many issues. We could do this every week probably.
The world moves fast.
It is moving very quickly. Let's talk about the Grawemeyer Program. You're at the University of Louisville, Kentucky, USA. What is the Grawemeyer Program?
This is a program that was founded, and we gave the first award in 1988 in World Order. There are 5 different awards. In addition to World Order, which the Political Science Department administers, there's music, psychology, religion, and education. And the World Order Award is, it was set up by Charles Grawemeyer, with the idea of encouraging people to develop works which would embody ideas that could somehow feasibly improve world order.
Mm-hmm. And our viewers can go to your website at www.grawemeyer.org.
That's correct.
And get a lot more information on the program.
Right. They can get the history, previous winners, and so on.
Well, prior to the program, you suggested we look at the last 3 winners of the Grawemeyer Award and take a look at some of their books and how they tie into some of the issues we're dealing with today. The most recent one was Masking and Unmasking Nations, War, Leadership, and Genocide in Modern Africa by Scott Strauss. What is the thrust of this book? Maybe that title is the thrust. How can we look at what he recommends and tie it into some of the problems we're dealing with?
Well, this book has gotten a great reception. Dr. Strauss, who's at the University of Wisconsin, has a fascinating study here. He looks at not only what causes genocide, but he also looks at a number of cases in Africa which could have turned genocidal but did not. And so he uses that approach to try to unpack or understand what are the critical inflection points where tensions between ethnic groups, religious groups, move toward genocide. And briefly, in a nutshell, what he finds is that the narratives that leaders develop are very important. Do they develop narratives which are inclusive and which view other ethnic or religious groups as useful or viable within the body politic? Or do they view these as others who are harmful, who are threatening to the group? Do they cast them then as being such a threat that the only thing left to do is to eliminate them as a group? And so it's a very important topic, and we're especially interested in how he identifies where external help may come in and prevent genocide.
And of course, we think back to Africa, think in the mid-90s with the Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, and I guess a modern-day version of that might be the Rohingya who have fled Myanmar, and thousands of them have fled, most of them have gone, I think, to Bangladesh and some other countries to live there. Are there suggestions that came out to help them to overcome this problem, even though some of them are moving back to Myanmar now, as I understand it?
Well, I think he would say, and I would say too, that that's more an example of ethnic cleansing, than actual genocide, because they're trying to displace the Rohingya rather than wipe them out as a people. But some of the same insights apply, and that is viewing them as completely different and alien to Myanmar, not being inclusive at all. And so Strauss's insights there, I think, bear very well, because the narrative, again, that even Aung San Suu Kyi will not challenge is that the Rohingya are foreign peoples. They've come in recently. They don't belong in Myanmar. And so that fits very well with what Strauss tells us.
Now, year before last, the winner wrote a book called Schools for Conflict or for Peace in Afghanistan.
Dana Birdie.
Dana Birdie, and of course this is an area that we've been involved in for at least 17 years. What suggestions does Dana Birdie make as far as that's concerned?
Well, she is a political scientist who also works with education issues. And so that's what the book is about, is, again, Schools for Conflict or for Peace. And she has spent something like 9 years on the ground in Afghanistan, knows it very well, the people, the language. And what she found was that, and this is an example of U.S. policy gone wrong. In the mid-1980s, during the Reagan administration, in order to oppose the Soviets who had invaded back in 1979, USAID funded a program through the University of Nebraska at Omaha, which developed jihadi textbooks that would encourage people to use the Muslim religion as extremism and then direct their struggles against the Soviet invaders. Of course, what happened after the Soviets left in 1989 was they kept the textbooks, and we produced millions of these. And they simply replaced the Soviet invaders with, the Western infidels, which included the United States. So that's a great example of a policy that went wrong, that actually came back and was very harmful to our interests.
And as we look at Afghanistan right now, what are as you look at this situation and some of the scholars who have focused on this, what can we do to bring some type of political, social, I would say a military solution, but I'm not sure that one is even possible. But what can be done in that area? Because the Taliban, they live there. They're not going anyplace, and the situation seems to be deteriorating as opposed to where it was a few years ago. Not that it was ever great.
No, and this has been going on, again, for 2 generations, I mean, decades. The Taliban probably controls somewhere around 40% of the territory now. Corruption is endemic, and you don't really have a governing state. I mean, one of the things I think we really need to do, we back in the Bush administration, the second one, we had ideas about building democracy in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and I don't think really anyone believes that anymore. But I think one of the things that comes out of the third winter, if you want to bring that one into it now, is the importance of ending the violence. Because what Haugen and Boutros, in their book, The Locust Effect, the finding that they come up with is that poverty doesn't lead to violence. It may, but that violence often is the reason for poverty in many developing countries. And in Afghanistan, I think, as in many other countries, the important thing is to stop the violence first, to have a viable governing state that can provide, in particular, police protection and the rule of law. That is so critical, and that's, again, what the Locust Effect says. And not just in war-torn areas. Which, again, Strauss says war is one of the fundamental reasons why we see genocide, but even in democracies. So they talk about India, they talk about Bolivia or Brazil, again, developing countries which are democratic, but have a rule of law that only benefits the wealthy and doesn't really help the poor people.
And that, when we talk about the rule of law, we're even talking about in the United States today, are we not? That
you could
the
do
situation
that.
is in flux so much here.
Sadly, when I was rereading The Locust Effect, what occurred to me was, in a way, I think African Americans and other minorities are subject to a different type of rule of law, that it especially benefits, wealthy and white Americans, and it works for them. But the sort of violence, which is really out of control in certain parts of cities, disproportionately affects minority populations, and that then contributes to their enduring poverty.
And we look at our prison, we're 5% of the population in the world, in the United States, and we have the lion's share, we have the largest number on a per capita basis of people in prisons, and most of them are minorities, African Americans. Many of them are in there for minor offenses, drug-related offenses, or something like that. So it seems like there are the rule of law. There are almost maybe two sets of rules of law in this country, or the one set for the white-collar criminals, and the other set for people who don't have resources, who have financial resources.
That's very true. And if I could bring it back to Afghanistan and make a point there, something a point that Dana Birdie makes in her book is that Afghans, it's often misperceived that they, a lot of them are opposed to education for girls. She makes the point, which dovetails with the Haugen and Boutros argument, that no, they want their girls to be educated, they want them to study science, but because of the lack of any rule of law or in basic police protection, they don't want their girls walking to school, which they have to do. They don't have buses, they can't drive them like suburban mothers can do. So they would rather keep them at home and sheltered and keep them from being assaulted, raped, or whatever on the way to school. And so again, that contributes to poverty. So it brings us back to the issue of education, violence, and poverty, and we see how these are interconnected.
Well, earlier I mentioned about chaos in the world, and there is quite a bit of chaos. Pick a spot, and for many reasons. And of course, the United States has played in the past anyway, critical role in trying to help deal with a lot of this chaos, with the problems. So often the United States has been labeled the policeman of the world. Does it still have that moniker, or do the people of the U.S. want it to have that moniker?
Well, I think it's changing. These things go in waves. There's probably a good half of the population, maybe slightly less, who really would prefer to see the U.S. be less active on the world stage. I think President Trump campaigned on that. Now, when he got into office, the pressures for staying engaged in the world were so great, and his advisors, I think, advised him against simply pulling out of places like Afghanistan or Iraq. But it's not an easy issue. It's something that I've wrestled with, and issues like humanitarian intervention, talking about genocide. Sometimes where we've intervened, as in Libya in 2011, there's a good argument to be made that we've made things worse. You don't easily build democracy. You don't easily build a rule of law. You don't easily bring education to young girls and women in very, very different societies. And so I think a certain amount of humility is good, but I wouldn't want to encourage, full-blown isolationism.
No, that would not be practical, because that will not stay that way forever.
No,
it will not be set in cement.
You can't stay isolated.
That
we found that out
sure.
in 9/11.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about pulling out. That brings to mind a couple of major areas where the United States has withdrawn. The one is with the Iranian nuclear deal, and also with the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And of course, we saw that both of them came online in 2015. Let's just talk about the Paris Climate Change Agreement. The United States has withdrawn from that, and all the other countries are still fully bore. They're totally in unison, I think, as far as trying to carry out and work on the climate change, because a lot of people believe it's the number one problem that we're dealing with in the world. And we can see every day the news is bad. The glaciers are melting, the desertification is taking place, the seas are rising. It's not a pretty picture, and the planet, if we stay on this trajectory, is going to be uninhabitable. What did that do as far as sidelining the United States by pulling us out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, even though there are many elements, cities, mayors, governors, businesses, universities that are still fully committed to the climate change agreement. But what's that done to us as a key player?
It's undercut our leadership in the world. And there are other things that we've done in recent years, and not just the Trump administration, but under the Obama and Bush administrations too. I think it has severely hurt our image as a country. You mentioned groups that are in support of it. I would add to that scientists who are not divided on this. Something like 95, 96% of all reputable scientists say yes, it's happening, and yes, it is anthropogenic. It's caused by people. Secondly, the military is very well aware of this, and they know the impact that this will have on their naval bases and so forth. And so they're certainly factoring that into their calculations. But this sort of withdrawal from the U.S. or stepping back from leadership, what's happening is China is now filling the void. We see Xi Jinping saying that China's not going to back out of it. China is not going to reject globalization and free trade. China is going to step forward. And another agreement that Mr. Trump pulled us out of on his first or second day in office was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This big trade arrangement we had done with 11 other countries in the Pacific, which would help us to shape the future of trade and investment in that region, intellectual property rights and so forth. And now, rather than being in the tent and being able to shape the discourse, we're outside, and we're again turning it over to the Chinese, who are moving ahead with their Belt and Road Initiative.
And the Trans-Pacific Partnership was really designed to keep China sidelined to a certain degree and to bring about 12 other countries in the Asia-Pacific region together to focus on this agreement. Now, with this basically unilaterally surrendering, when the United States pulled out, we've turned it over to China. In fact, they're trying to set up another agreement to replace this one. And the other members, I guess the other 11 members or so, they're moving on without the United States. So again, we're on the sidelines.
That's right. It was, in a way, it was a smart deal because it didn't just sideline China, but it said, look, if you want to play by these rules, if you want to respect intellectual property rights, and give businesses a better chance to invest and operate, then you can buy into it at some point. And it would have put China in a bind. But now they're basically released from that.
You mentioned the Belt and Road Project. This is a massive undertaking. I think it's over $1 trillion that China is investing, at least, in 4 continents to set up these trading arrangements. They're moving forward to develop trading opportunities, commercial opportunities with people in 4 different continents. And we in the United States cannot even get an infrastructure program underway to deal with our bridges, roads, airports that are absolutely in horrible shape. What is going on?
Well,
Give me a good answer.
What's going on? It's, again, I think we have gotten to the point where we're unwilling to spend what we need to on infrastructure or on healthcare or other areas, and we are slipping backward, I think, in relative terms. This is not going to happen overnight. We're talking decades out. But you're right, China's Belt and Road Initiative runs past South Asia, places like Pakistan, through Central Asia, through Russia. There's this a big industrial park now that they've just completed in Belarus, of all places. The Middle East, they're moving into there diplomatically, economically. The Horn of Africa, openings to Latin America, where they're already surpassing us in trade. So this is happening. And the Chinese, I'm not trying to say they're omnipotent and they're making mistakes and they're throwing a lot of money away on this, but they have a lot of money to throw away. And money is buying them influence in a lot of parts of the world. And the U.S., again, we're sort of shirking the leadership that we had exercised from World War II on.
One other area that we're creating chaos, the U.S. is really working to create chaos, is with Iran. We just pulled out, the Trump administration just pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal, which came online in 2015. It was the 5 permanent members of the United States, or the United Nations, plus Germany, plus the EU, and some other people were involved, other groups involved. But how do you perceive this? If the agreement holds and the 4 members say they want it to hold, everybody, the whole world has basically said they wanted to hold because the agreement was working. It was keeping Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. We know that for a fact. The International Atomic Energy Agency monitors have been in there following this through, and that was the only goal. It wasn't to cut off funding to Hamas or anything like that. It was just to keep them from going nuclear. It was working, and now we've pulled out, which could destabilize it and really make more chaos.
Well, I would agree with that. I think it was a bad idea to pull out of it, certainly. And it's going to further strain our relations with the Europeans. We've already seen problems there in NATO. But certainly the Germans, the French, and others in Europe, I think, are really unhappy with, again, the U.S. not showing leadership on this. As far as I can tell, the argument is that the bad actions that Iran is doing, and there's certainly plenty of them, in Syria, supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, what they're doing in Yemen, supporting the Houthis. Again, all this is really destabilizing the region. We're supporting Saudi Arabia, and we're supporting Israel. And they are definitely both, I think, more worried about Iran's conventional actions than they would about a potential nuclear capability further down the road. And that seems to have been the argument that won the day in the White House.
It did. And during this whole debate on Iran, there was so much misinformation that came out. You hear some of the talking heads on Fox and some of the other stations putting out so much misinformation and talking about how the Iranians really were cheating. We've proven that. That has not been proven at all. They said that so often that the United States, it sounded like they just arbitrarily gave the Iranian government $150 billion. And in reality, what that was money that the U.S. had frozen. When we got into this imbroglio with Iran, it was Iranian money. We froze $150 billion, and all we gave back to them was something like $54 billion, which was their own money, and that was part of the agreement. So we actually came out ahead on that for a change. But there's just so much misinformation out there, and that's not only true in this Iranian thing, but just about every issue that we get into, that today facts don't seem to matter. They just put the spin out, just put nonsense out, and let somebody else defend it. But it's getting hard to debate these issues where we used to 15, 20 years ago.
Well, it is, and you had mentioned the climate change agreement earlier. It seems to be a general disrespect for science and for education in this country. Now that, again, is worrisome to me because if you're going to progress, if you're going to develop economically, you need to use science. You need to have science. You need to have good, solid education. And I think, again, other countries are looking forward more, and we may be looking backward and just saying, we don't trust the science. And science doesn't have all the answers, but I would sure rather have an expert surgeon working on me than I would have just an amateur who had never done any operation.
That's true.
I value expertise. We should in politics.
That's for sure. No doubt about that. Well, these issues are so important, and they're so just really life and death issues to a large degree. One institution that you and I have talked about for years, the United Nations, again, the only multilateral organization in the world that brings 193 countries of the world together. When we look at the UN touches our lives every day. We don't think about how the UN does. We think of the Security Council, maybe peacekeeping. And those are important. I'm not arguing that. But the UN touches our lives through helping move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information, teaming up with Rotarians around the world to eliminate polio, working with Kiwanians around the world to eliminate iodine deficiency disorders, so many things. But, the polls, Chuck, over the years have shown that the people in the United States have supported the UN anywhere from about 40 to 85% of the time, depending upon the issue. But they also show that we don't understand the United Nations, but we want to participate in the UN. We want to participate in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What is the disconnect there? Why are we multilateralists, internationalists to some degree, but we don't understand these organizations?
Well, again, I think it is lack of education. As you said about the UN, and I've seen that with my students, where the focus is always on, oh, the Chinese or the Russians have vetoed something in the UN Security Council, so we don't get what we want. And they don't know, again, what UNESCO is doing. They don't know about the work with Ebola or basic child nutrition or clean water, that sort of thing. So again, I would look at just the basic ignorance of foreign policy issues. And we also have now with certain media promoting the idea of this is a threat to our sovereignty, promoting conspiracies. A number of people do buy into that.
They certainly do, and that's what we have to remember too, that it's up to us to ferret out the information, and especially with social media today, we've seen how much misinformation comes out on Facebook and many other venues, and it's up to the public to really kind of sort through this and to go to sources that can provide basic information, such as Global Connections, television.com, put in a plug for that. And they can also learn more about the Grawemeyer Award and the great work that you're doing by going to grawemeyer.org. But we really need to focus on these issues because, as I mentioned, they are life and death, especially if we lose this battle with climate change. And we can see every day that the scientific reports are not getting brighter. They're really getting more challenging. And by 2100, for the folks who are still around, we're going to have a planet that will be almost uninhabitable, if not totally uninhabitable. But Dr. Charles Ziegler at the University of Louisville, Kentucky, USA, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and very informative program.
It was great.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.